June 1966, and my mate Dave and I were back at Manchester, Victoria. We had a plan to get to Bolton Shed, but I was rather enjoying the classic Vicky atmosphere. The wallside bankers were waiting for work, and a couple of long parcels trains came through. Good times. I almost gave in to temptation, wanting to stay at Vicky, but Dave reminded me, rather sternly I thought, about our objective. So we caught a bus to Bolton, a number 8 I think, but it's a long time ago. I remember being impressed by the bus, a brand new Atlantean, and the livery, nicer than our SHMD buses at home. It was straight out of the box, a treat to ride on. The friendly driver tipped us where to get off. Somewhere on Manchester Road, if I remember. We then walked over the railway bridge on Green Lane before turning right onto Crescent Road. Dave had his Ian Allen guide, which was invaluable for finding Loco depots. Trouble was, it only gave the official entrances, not so handy if you didn't have a permit, and we didn't. At the entrance, which was between a row of terraced houses and a shop on Crescent Road, a stern notice said, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." This is what it looks like now. Dave and I gazed anxiously at each other, then sneaked in, heading for the cover of the shed wall. I could see some Locos in the yard, and I wondered what would be in the shed. But I never found out because a hand grabbed my shoulder roughly, followed by a growled, "Get out!" Dave and I were escorted to the entrance by a grumpy old guy in BR overalls. Well, we bought some sweets from the shop near the entrance, sat on the mill wall, and on a sugar high from a Mars bar, put Plan B into operation. We walked back beside the mill that loomed to our left. Dave had seen what he thought could be a way in for us on the railway side of the mill. He'd spotted it when we'd been on the Green Lane Bridge. More trespassing, but this time nobody saw us or didn't care. Nowadays, of course, everything would be fenced off with that galvo metal spear fencing, but back then it was open. A wilderness, actually. So Dave and I went into stealth mode. We crept along until the back of the shed yard was reached. Then we saw a gap in the fence. We were in, like a couple of ferrets. Several black fives were taking their ease, a Fairburn tank, and a crab. Apparently, locally, crabs were called dippers. I don't know why. But I was happy, since they were my favourite Locos and I hadn't seen one up close before. Meanwhile, Dave got on with the serious business of taking numbers. There was a huge noise, which came from the coaling tower, as the wagon's contents was tipped into the bunker. We were both blackened as a cloud of dust wafted over. The Stania Black 5 rolled off shed, wheels groaning and squealing. Dave thought he saw the grumpy guy from earlier and darted for the cover of one of the Locos. This was wonderful. I crouched, panting, feeling the heat from the Loco and its steamy, oily, sulphurous smell. We grinned at each other. This was bloody good fun. Some of these photos were kindly supplied by Nigel Valentine, the custodian of the late Harvey Scowcroft's prodigious folio of images. Nigel has a super Flickr album of Harvey's genius. I'll leave a link in the description. One strange thing was that some of the Locos looked clean, like oily rag clean. Dave said maybe they were fresh from Horwich Works, but to my eyes they didn't look the way X-Works engines did. Not that you saw many of those in the 60s. The clean Locos were 8Fs. The BR Tankies, lovely little Locos, were pretty grimy. There were a number of 2MT moguls, Mickey Mouses we used to call them, all pretty work-stained. Years later, I learnt that a group of local lads came round cleaning some of the Locos. Recently I managed to get in touch with someone who knew the lads. So here we see Paul Salverson and Keith Pendlebury cleaning an 8F. My informant, one of the cleaners, Vernon Sidlow, has some fabulous shots. like this 8F having a bit of trouble with the freight at Bolton East Junction. Superb. Vernon reckons that this shot cost him, as it made him late for work. I'd lose a month's wages to be able to get that shot. Thanks, Vernon, for the wonderful photos. Naively, I really wanted to find an old L&Y tank in the shed. I loved those Aspinall 242 tanks. They were so handsome. Of course, back in the day, Bolton had quite a roster of Locos. In the 1950s, the Barton Wright 060 saddle tanks could still be seen, as well as the Class 25 ironclad 060s built in 1887. These long-lasting machines were at one time a familiar sight at Bolton, before their withdrawal in the late 50s. Of course, they'd been modified by Aspinall, but they were still a straight line from the old L&Y. Sadly, Dave and I were way too young to have seen a high flyer. Another class we missed was the 7F, Fowler 080s, Austin 7s they were known as. Several spent their last years here rattling themselves to bits in the 1950s. On the Shedbash UK website, there's a Loco allocation which would make any L&Y man find he had dust in his eyes. On our visit, there was a WD Class 280 which looked massive, but it was out of steam. It was brutal. Dave said that they rode like a bag of spanners, but it left a big impression on me. Then, disaster! We accidentally got in the way of a fitter climbing off a Loco. I was terrified, but he just smiled and said, watch where you're going, you daft buggers. Phew! As usual, the other enginemen couldn't see us, as if we were invisible. So it was just old Grumpy who had it in for us. Well, it was a great afternoon, worth saving up for. As we left through the railings again, we met a couple of friendly local lads who told us that the chap who'd thrown us off was an old driver, waiting to retire. His eyesight wasn't good enough for driving, so he was in charge of the sand furnace. We walked back up Crescent Road towards town. I suggested getting a train back to Vic. Dave agreed, so we headed to the station. Bolton Trinity Street, while still looking impressive, was in need of some TLC. When we visited, the canopy seen in these photos had recently been brutally gas-axed off, and the stumps were still evident. Inside it was probably how it had always looked, just more careworn. On the platforms, DMUs were lurking, including our train. Then we heard a Stania hooter and a parcels train rumble through with a Class 5 in charge. Bolton Station is a bit different today. They've kept the tower, but moved it to the bus station. At the time of our visit, there was still a lot of industry in Bolton. Mill chimneys were all over the place. That's changed, of course. Many of the local chimneys were demolished by Bolton's very own Fred Dibner. Chimneys he'd worked on previously. I wish that I'd taken more notice of things besides the railways in Bolton back then. It looked a fascinating place. But heck, we were young, and besides steam locos, there were girls and music to think about. Well, here's the 1911 Ordnance Survey map showing the Loco shed, then the mills, and then the collieries. Finally, a map overlay showing the place today, which, as you would expect, has changed slightly. Beehive has gone, as have the sheds. The site of the collieries is a country park. There's subsidence from the mines, so housing over that lot isn't a good idea. But anyway, back to Dave and I. A year after we'd been to Bolton, Dave's dad offered to take us himself one Sunday. He was a great guy, very generous, especially as he didn't have any interest in railways. We walked into the sheds, past the no trespassing sign, this time with a permit. It felt good, but not as exciting as the first visit. There were more Locos, yeah, but all black 5s, 8Fs or standard 5s. All the others had gone. The Locos were all dozing away in light steam. There were quite a few other lads about too, But what depressed me was the long line of Demic Locos that would never move again. All the Mickey Mouses and a couple of 8Fs. Very sad. I keenly felt the need to see more sheds before it was all over. So after Bolton, Dave and I combed the northwest, accompanied by an ever-growing brotherhood of enthusiasts, also trying to catch the last gasp of steam, to the detriment of our A-levels. Bolton closed in June 1968. The few remaining Locos scuttled off to Patricroft to see out the last guttering of the candle. Now, houses cover everything. The Shed has a development built over it called The Sheddings. That's original, isn't it? Beehive Mill is gone. The place is unrecognisable. Okay, not everybody likes industry the way I do, and to some folk the place was an eyesore. But my memories of Bolton and its Shed tell me otherwise. Well, apart from that pong from the tanneries. Lastly, a fun fact. Bolton sort of featured in a film, The Love Match, starring Arthur Askey. He was supposed to be a driver from Bolton, but the film dodges about all over the place, Bolton, Newton Heath, and even Southall, Middlesex. For old Boltonians, this still is between the Rose Hill and Railway Tanneries on Nelson Street, with a Bolton transport bus on Route 3 from Townley's to the left. This shot definitely is Bolton MPD. Near the end of the film, a player takes a shot at Burndon Park in Bolton, and the ball hits the back of the net at Charlton, over 200 miles away. Perhaps it's remiss of me not to include a little bit of history before we go. So, Bolton Shed was built in 1875 by the L&Y and was modernised by the LMS. The 60-foot turntable was put in during 1940. Here's a wonderful A.G. Ellis photo of it in 1938. Thank you so much for watching this. I hope you've enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done already. Stay tuned for more shed bashing tales soon. Lastly, a huge thank you to the photographers who've helped generously with their work. There are links to all of them in the introduction.